Hey everybody, welcome back to this week's weekly tech review. This is going to be the tech review for week 11. So, before we start today, I want to just, ask you guys a simple question here. What do you guys think really makes us intelligent as humans? Do you think it's our ability to think, to speak, or do you think there's something deeper than that? Well, today we're going to be exploring how human intelligence is shaped by language, thought, and the brain, and how this compares to AI. So, without further ado, let's jump right into it. So, before we talk about AI, let's first focus on us as humans, right? How do we process language, thoughts, and so on, right? So here you can see on the screen, we have a picture of the human brain. And let's focus on the left hemisphere of the brain here, because this is usually where all the language processing primarily occurs. So in this yellow area right here, we have something called the frontal lobe. And the frontal lobe helps us with planning, decision making, and speech production. And then if you come a little ways over here to this sort of pink reddish area, this is called the temporal lobe. And the temporal lobe is very crucial for understanding spoken language, right? For us to sort of take in an input of a certain language and then translating that in a way so that we can understand personally, right? Sort of like a translator. So these specialized regions form what's called a language network, which is different from other parts of the brain that usually handle stuff like math and music or bodily function control, like moving your arms and whatnot. So what does this really tell us? This tells us that language isn't just a byproduct of intelligence, but rather it's a dedicated system in the brain, right? Meaning it's just that special, right? Which is quite interesting, and that on some level we handle language subconsciously. We don't really have to think about it all that much, right? It's just natural, right? When you understand a language, when you learn a language, at a certain point, you're able to just pick up on words without having to think about, what does that sound like? What does that mean? All stuff like that. You just know it. So very, very interesting. So now let's start talking about AI, right? So on the screen here, you can see a simple neural network model. And once again, this neural network model is like the core idea behind many AI systems. So as you can see here, there is a input layer, or one or more hidden layers, but for this instance, I just used one hidden layer here. And then finally, you have an output layer, which is like each made nodes and neurons and stuff like that. So as you can see, there's all these different connections, right? And each connection has its own weight. Just to just how very what's the word I'm talking about? Synapses in our brain vary in strength, right? It works the same way. But here, the network learns by adjusting these weights during the training process, and normally aims to reduce prediction errors. So, if you guys can notice, there's a lot of similarities between this neural network model and how our brain works and handles information and stuff like that, right? However, though, while inspired by our biological brain, this system is vastly simpler than how the human brain actually works, right? So even though we're taking, we're like similar, this is sort of like similar to the brain, it's not a one-to-one copy. And why that is So here here I created a diagram, really focusing on how transformer models like GPT handle language. So in this section right here of input vectors, you put certain input words right into these vectors, and essentially what this does is it converts these input words into vectors, which are just mathematical representations of meaning. Then after which, these vectors are then pushed to stacked encoder blocks. And this is usually where the model learns the patterns and the relationships between these vectors. And then after that, finally an output is pushed. And it's often a prediction of the next word or phrase. Now, what's interesting here is that unlike the human brain, this process lacks grounding in sensation or context, and it's really all based on statistical patterns in text, right? So you're probably wondering, what does that mean? So what this really means is that AI can sound smart, but it doesn't really understand what it's saying, which, as you can probably imagine, it separates us from AI. Because when we say something, we usually understand, we mainly understand the words behind us saying that, right? For AI, they don't understand what they're really saying. So let's really dive a little bit deeper into that, right? About the separation between human language and AI language, right? So as we discussed, AI language is vastly different than human language. Right? So for the AI, language is data. Just a sequence of symbols, processed statistically to generate or interpret meaning. So AI doesn't understand language the same way human does. Like I said before, it learns patterns from massive amounts of text and predicts the likely combination of words. Right? So whenever it's saying something to you, it's not really able to really think about what it's saying. It's just going based off of its training data to speak with you, to converse with you, right? Which is not a clear understanding of what language is. So there are 4 different ways that AI can handle language, right? There is something it can handle it by using tokenization, and tokenization is when it's able to break the language into units, such as words, parts of words, symbols, right? Another form is embedding. And embedding converts these tokens into vectors, which once again, vectors mathematical forms. Next one will be prediction, and prediction uses models to predict the next token based on the context. And then finally, you have the output, which generates a coherent response using the probability. However, though, that is not true understanding, right? True understanding is able to produce an output and understand what you are saying, right? AI can only do half of that, which is quite interesting. So now the main question on everyone's minds is that will there be a point where AI is going to be able to surpass human intelligence, or at least be able to think the same way humans can, right? But ultimately, if that were to happen, we would be able to have to replicate the human brain. Now, is that possible, or are we just going to hit a plateau? Well, there is one man by the name of Jim DeCarlo who believes that he can somehow replicate the human brain for artificial intelligence. So this whole thing is just basically reverse engineering the brain, right? So how does he plan on tackling this? Well, to break things down, you have to take a complex biological system like the brain and break it down into parts that we can try to fully understand, or at least somewhat understand, because even now we don't really understand the full extent of the human brain. So after that, we then want to build artificial models that behave like the real system and then can be tested the same way we test the brain. So, for instance, this would include stuff like sensory processing, neural activity, body motor functions, right? All these different tests, right, that we normally use for the brain. He essentially wants to create AI models based off of those different sections of the brain and test it like that, which is quite interesting. So how does he plan on tackling this, right? So he studies how the brain transforms sensory inputs, such as vision, for instance, into decisions and actions. So he plans on using tools like neural recordings, which is, I believe, used to measure the brain activity. Then you have brain imaging, which is used to observe regions that are active, like when they light up in the brain. And then you have deep learning models, which are going to be used to simulate the brain process information. So why is all this important? Why is all this important to help further AI? Well, according to him, he said to understand the brain, you have to build models that can predict and explain what the brain does. And he also believes that by doing this, we can solve a myriad amount of problems, right? He said that we can treat neurological diseases more effectively, right? Because we can test them with these artificial models. Then we can build more human-like AI systems. So no longer will we ever run into the problem of AIs just saying stuff and not really understanding what they're saying. More intelligent AI systems. And then also, we can also have a deeper dive into how humans think, learn, and adapt to various situations. Because by that, because if we have the AI models that are basically able to help replicate how the brain works and thinks, then we can essentially figure out how we think. Anyway, that's going to be it for today's video. I hope you guys all enjoyed, and I will catch you all in the next one.